Hello my brothers and sisters of the Order, welcome back to the Order. I am Celtic Templar, and today y'all, rather than finishing up our how-to series on the said Irish for the 12th century, I decided we should actually do a what-if scenario on what if the said Normans failed to conquer England in the said Norman conquest at the Battle of Hastings. Now, in such since the said anniversary of the Battle of Hastings is coming up, I decided, you know what, I might as well get into this. Now, I want to put this out here. Also, a couple of others, especially one of my own YouTubers, Cody from Alternate History, has actually done a video on this. I do agree with some of his ideas, but I disagree on a lot of the others. So, what shall we actually end up covering this? Well, we shall end up covering what if actually William the Conqueror had not actually won at the Battle of Hastings. And I want to put this out here. There are several key things that could have actually happened. One is the major thing that could have happened is that the weather could have actually changed. Instead of Duke William actually landing in the said region of England and during the time of 1066, it will probably be a year later, in 1067. Now, why is this? Simple. The weather. The weather was the major reason why Duke William could never actually cross the said British Channel. Now, I hear many people already saying, but wait, what does the weather have to do with anything? Simple. You could only cross the said English Channel at a certain amount of time. And the fact is, Duke William and his army were stuck in Normandy, waiting for the weather to change. Now, how I do want to explain is that during this type of time, Duke William had taken a major debt from none other than the King of France, and as well, the Pope himself in Rome. Now, this explains a lot into the historical forms. Why? Simple. Because one, it was technically viewed as a crusade, and anybody that would go on this supposed crusade to actually conquer England in the name of the Duke would be pretty much absolved of their sins, and a lot of them did take this chance. However, in this alternate timeline, this would not end well for them at all. So rather than instead of landing in 1066, they land in 1067. And when they do so, they are met with the full force of the Saxons. They probably meet at Hastings again. Such, Duke William and his forces would sack various regions in the said area of around Hastings, but then have to fight the English at Hastings. However, during this battle, we could probably end up seeing Duke William probably almost losing his life several times as he did in our own timeline. That's right, Duke William's own horse got killed underneath him several times. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. So, let's say in one of these type of scenarios, instead of mounting another horse, he is carried from the field of battle, and in such, it would then be believed that the Duke is dead. William is later on pulled from the field of battle, not being able to command his forces, nor to tell them that, hey, I live, by lifting up his said helmet. In this incident, it could end up leading to the said Norman rout. The Normans are kicked out of England. Because of this, it is viewed as an English victory, and that God actually had the side of the Saxons. So much so that, one, in this alternate timeline, we could probably see the said Normans being forced to pay back a huge debt. Mainly because, one, they actually tricked the said Pope in Rome and the King of France to go into war of what something they should never have done. Now, with this scenario and such, we could probably even see the Saxons wanting to take their revenge. How so? Simple. By raiding the said coasts of Normandy. These raids would immediately be a threat to not only the Normans, but even the French. The French throne would immediately force Duke William to pretty much force him to actually view the said throne of England in the hands of the English. Harold Godwinson would immediately be the King of England. And during this time, we could probably even see the Kingdom of Elba, or Scotland, raiding and as well conquering lands in the region of England. So much so that one, Harold Godwinson would have no other choice but to accept the terms, rather than accepting further on land in the region of France. In such, we could probably even see a said secured border between the Scots and the said Saxons. In fact, one of Harold Godwinson's own actions was to make sure that there would be a peace negotiation between the Scots and the Saxons. This was his decree before his death, but because he died, it never actually got further way in. We could probably see the border of Hadrian's Wall being the only border between the said Saxons and the said Scots. The reason I chose the said Hadrian's Wall is because, one, we don't have an actual idea of where the border was to take place between the two kingdoms. All that we do know is that the two kingdoms were supposed to agree upon a said border. Of what that border was, we have no idea. So, yeah, the Hadrian's Wall is the best theory I can come up with. Soon after this, we could probably even see the Kingdom of the Normans having to actually pay back a massive debt, not just to the said Saxons, but even the French throne, and the said Holy Papacy itself. So, what is Duke William to do? He can't go to England, he can't go anywhere else. So what is he to do? Simple, go on a crusade. But not on the said Holy Land. It was actually to the region of Iberia. Why Iberia, you might ask? For one major simple reason, to help out the said Kingdom of Castile and Aragon, as these two kingdoms were mainly fighting a war against the said Muslim Moors in the region of Spain. So, Duke William would actually do this in his own type of time. With the aid of the Duke, we could probably end up seeing the said forces of the Normans and as well Aragon and Castile actually pushing back the said Muslims in the said region of Iberia, conquering further land in order to help actually push out the said Muslims and reconquest of Iberia, mainly with the use of cavalry and castle. Now this is another thing I want to put out here. There is one major thing of a difference that in which will come in this historical time, and that would be there would be no said castles nor cavalry units in the region of England. Now, many people would immediately say, but wait a minute, I thought the said English had cavalry and castles. Not exactly. In fact, Anglo-Saxon England did not have the said infamous cavalry horse like we see used by the said Normans. Those come after the Norman invasion. In fact, the Saxons actually used horses identical to that of the said Irish, Welsh, and the Scots used. However, these were not the infamous cavalry horses like we see that of use of cavalry units such as medieval knights. These are more meant for skirmish-style warfare, in which was something that the entirety of the Anglo-Saxons actually disapproved of. So much so that one, they didn't even use them in major battles. They only used them for riding from point A to point B, and never used them in major military campaigns. In fact, they were more viewed as a horse of labor rather than a horse of war by the Saxon nobles. So yeah, just because you see them being used in major films or even a series and such, doesn't mean the said Saxons really used them. Yeah, this is why I am never a fan of the series Vikings or any of these modern shows that show of said Saxon using horses on the battlefield. As well, the castle will not be a use of the said Saxons, as the fact being, the Saxons didn't actually have said military strategy to use such a tactic. So, why is this? Simple. The early castle, like the Motte and Bailey, was more meant for a form of invasion and as well as strategic warfare. The English, on the other hand, preferred a form of walled structure system. In other words, build a fortification around the city. Kind of identical to how the Romans had their idealisms. In fact, this idea has actually been used throughout the entire time in history. However, the people of Wales, Scotland, and as well Ireland also had forts, though these forts were a little different and were more of a ring fort-like system. However, they were still a good way to actually resupply and as well aid to their forces in invasions and as well as strategic supplies. England did not have this. The Anglo-Saxons would probably end up keeping to a said border system probably up until the 12th century. Why do I say the 12th century? Simple. 1. The Saxons actually had to refortify their own borders. And this was the major idealisms of none other than Harold Godwinson. However, with the Normans, we could probably see Duke William conquering lands in the region of Iberia in the name of God and the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon. When he's not busy helping out Castile and Aragon, he was conquering lands probably in the region of Iberia and would later be able to actually hold on to lands in Brittany and as well Flanders. Because of this, we could probably see the said Normans further expanding their kingdom. By the time of William's death, we would probably even see the said lands of the Normans even further expanded, mainly by his sons. And his sons would go on crusades, not just to the Holy Land, but in Iberia. Because of this further conquest, we could actually see the Norman kingdom becoming richer and richer in the process. And throughout the time in history, we would even see the rise of the Angevin dynasty. Why the Angevin dynasty, you might ask? Simple. This would be the same type of dynasty of King Richard the Lionheart. King Richard would expand his kingdom further on and further out history, such as conquering regions in Iberia, as well as Aquitaine and such, and even further in the region, even further such in like Sicily and Italy being part of the Norman Empire, and even conquering parts of North Africa. All the while, the Saxons, on the other hand, would also venture and even conquer lands into parts of Wales, and as well, even going into the region of Ireland. Now, why Ireland? Simple. Well, if now you understand history, there is the infamous invasion of the said Anglo-Irish that later invade the said region of Ireland during the 12th century, mainly because they were invited in. Mercenary Saxon housecarls or Saxon military nobles that were hired on by said a usurped king in Ireland to help him reclaim his throne. This could probably still happen just like it did in our own timeline. Instead of knights on horses, we see Saxons with axes. So Gallowglass would still somewhat exist, only they would fight axe against axe instead of axe against said mounted knight. Throughout the time in history, we would start to see the further conquest of not only the said Normans, but even the Scots would even claim the northern lands in the north. So it still somewhat follows the same form in a history. The only difference is we don't see the major military castles like we do in our own timeline. In fact, we don't see castles in Wales, we don't see castles in regions of England or Scotland, or even Ireland. In fact, the British Isles doesn't have any castles, which kinda says something. However, we do see Norman-style castles all throughout the regions of Iberia and parts of France. Because the Normans are not focused in England anymore, we could probably end up seeing them conquering further lands in the region of said Iberia and North Africa, creating a said Norman Empire. However, all things do come to an end, and that would be during the time of King John of England, or, in this case, King John of the Angevin dynasty. King John would lose further lands and even be kicked out of the lands of Flanders and Normandy, losing the title of the Norman Kingdom. All of his brother's great gains would be down the toilet. So, yeah, we could probably end up seeing the said kingdoms even fighting against each other. The Normans would still hold on to their land, but probably not as big as they once were. It would only be after the said death of King John that we would probably end up seeing the said rise of his own son, Henry III. Henry would probably actually conquer further lands and re-establish the said Angevin dynasty in certain regions. In fact, by the end of the 13th century, we could even see the Normans rising to power, conquering lands as far as Crete. This leading to the fact that, one, the said Normans would become a major naval military units. However, the threat to England would mostly be of its own borders, mainly between the Scots and the Irish, fighting various wars in their own time. One major thing I want to put out here, we might not actually see the Scottish War of Independence, for one major reason. One, we would probably not see Edward the Longshanks of England. Reason being, because one, his dynasty is of that of the Norman bloodline. So without him, there is no Edward. No King Edward, no said conquest of Scotland. Now, major reason I have to put this out here is for major reasons. Because one, Edward wanted a conquest of Scotland in his own time. And another thing I have to put out here, I doubt the Saxons would be like that of the Norman bloodline. What do we mean by this? Simple. We can actually see this during the time of the Saxons' invasions into Wales. The Saxons and the Welsh actually fought each other, but as many times over, the Welsh fought back, and vice versa, it always ended in defeat for both sides. In fact, at one point in time, a Saxon king had actually been given a message by the said Welsh kingdom that he was invading at the time, that the king that he had fought against had actually died due to mysterious circumstances. All the while, they asked for a said truce until the said king is buried, in which this happened sometime around the 8th century, and in such, the Saxons honored this request. So, just like in our own timeline, we would probably see the Scots actually, well, asking the English hey, we need a middleman to help us out in order to find a peaceful solution to having a said king. So much so, one, we would probably see the Saxons jumping at it to say, well, yeah, we'll agree, just don't invade us for the next few years, for a whole generation or two. Honestly, what it could be, I have no idea. But the thing is, with this, we don't know what type of king could be chosen. Maybe Robert the Bruce actually does become King of Scotland, without any type of hustle and fuss. Now many people would say, well, what about John Balliol? Well, there is a problem with that one. Well, for one major reason. He was viewed as so weak, and as well so unpopular by the Scottish noblemen, that he was actually the perfect candidate for Edward to actually use. In this alternate timeline, I don't know who's going to win. In fact, maybe even John Comyn, but I highly doubt it. So, maybe Robert the Bruce actually does become King of Scotland. All without the said Scottish War of Independence. So in other words, this would just be a small footnote in history. But maybe we would see a said Scottish War of Independence. I don't know. I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments on this one. No matter what, I could still see the said Saxons being on the back foot. Majorly because, one, these guys would prefer to actually fight in a major conflict type deal against the Scots in a form of defense rather than offense. Because whenever the English invaded, they lost major military units in a major battle, in which is something they didn't want. The Normans, though, would further on keep controlling various lands and holdings and even spread their empire even further. In fact, Edward I of England could probably even establish his own military units in the said region, and even further on start a 100 Years' War with France, like we see in our own timeline. However, I doubt that this could actually lead to anything good for them, seeing to the fact that, one, even in our own timeline, England itself was pushed out by the said French. So this would probably happen the same to the Normans. Over time, the Normans would be pushed out of France and become, well, more of a said North African, Mediterranean, Iberian culture. So much so that, one, the entirety of the Norman dynasty kind of becomes that type of subject. We can even still probably see the Kingdom of Spain being established between the said kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. England itself would later on conquer Ireland, probably around the 17th century, and the same with Scotland joining into the thrones by the time of the 18th century. So in such, majorly geographically, hardly anything changes. The only thing that majorly changes is the fact there is no Norman identity in England. In fact, the Normans are another version of Portugal, only a little bit stronger. Maybe even in a later time they could end up becoming, say, unite with the said Spanish throne. Honestly, I kind of would like to see that happen, but I don't have any idea of what that could have ended up looking like. But another thing that changes is the said culture. In fact, without the Norman invasion, we don't actually see a modern day English. We actually get something more, well, different. We end up having something like that of a said Celtic Saxon language. Now, if none of you know what Old English sounds like, here's the thing. I dare you to read the tale of Beowulf without its modern English translation. Because here's the thing, Old English is beyond weird to understand. In fact, it sounds more German than it does sound English. So, yeah. Now, many of y'all would end up viewing this as weird, but this would actually be very common in this region. However, instead of French and Anglo-Saxon languages mixing together, it turns into more of a said Germanic Saxon English language mixed in with Celtic, like Scot, Irish, and Welsh. So much so that, one, we end up seeing something entirely different. Now, also entirely different would be the religious changes. Because if you actually also remember my saying about this being viewed as a crusade in this time, that is actually more than true. As the fact is, the Saxons had actually ended up using a different form of religion compared to the rest of the said European cultures. What do we mean by this? Well, quite simply, it would be a different variation of a religion. For example, here is a map between Catholics and the said Protestants in the region of our own modern day. Now, view this a little differently. Because one, just because the Irish are Catholic doesn't mean they were Roman Catholic. Even in our own timeline, they were viewed as Celtic Catholic until the said 15th century. So much so that one, Celtic Catholicism itself was in the region of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and even the region of Brittany, while the Saxons were actually more of an idealism of what is called the Anglo-Saxon Church. So what is it different compared to the said modern-day church of the English Protestantism? Well, simple. They did view the same idealisms as Catholics, only a little different. How so? Simple. The Saxons did not view the said Pope the said main speaker of the Catholic Church. So in such, this would be more of an idealism of said faiths and cultures. In other words, we would see a more of a Saxon and Celtic religions in the region of Britain, of the British Isles, rather than whatever it is now. In fact, without the said Normans, we don't have the Tudors of England. That means that we don't have said Henry the Fat becoming a major prick and destroying historical castles and killing off anybody that's Catholic. Yeah, England, I see you right now. This also means that we don't actually see the said English Civil War. Now, what do I mean by this? Simple. The Saxons followed what is called a Witan or Witan. This is a really impressive thing to talk about. Why? Simple. The Witan actually caused nobles to actually vote for their own king. For example, if he went against any type of laws, he'd be pretty much held up to judgment and be put into a vote. So much so that a descendant could, just because you were a descendant of a said king, doesn't mean that you had to become king. You had to prove yourself, and if you did not prove yourself, a Witan would immediately be called. In fact, Witans were even called during the time when a king had actually still been in power. So much so that I could probably end up seeing England and the British Isles never falling into a civil war. So, yeah, there is still that type of subject. Now, I want to put this out here though. What does this mean for our alternate timeline? Well, simple. We do still see the conquest of Americas and such, just like with the English, the French, and as well the Spanish and Portuguese. Only, we see the Normans and Spanish being, well, a little different. In fact, I probably see the said Normans being like the Portuguese, conquering the said region of said Brazil, and even colonizing parts of Africa from around the south. But maybe even still, maybe Spain and the Normans could join together into becoming a greater kingdom. Who knows? Because with this alternate timeline, we have a different type of subject at hand in history. So much so that it is entirely impossible to tell the difference. But what do y'all think? Do you think this actually alternate time was a little better, or do you still prefer the original? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have any ideas for an alternate history subject for later on with the Romans and such, I'd like to hear y'all's ideas. Anyways, this has been Celtic Templar. Hope to see you in the next one. Like and subscribe for more.